whether Trump wins or loses, I think there's a large number of people who have been primed to act by this violent rhetoric that he's been spewing for years. And I'm very worried about the election. I think the risks of violence are high.
We know that there's lots of things happening in America right now. We've got Joe Biden, who's just won the nomination. We've got Donald Trump, who's just won the nomination. And Donald Trump was at a rally and in Ohio, and he used some pretty inflammatory language. Let's listen to what he had to say.
And you're not going to be able to sell those guys. If I get elected, now, if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole. That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it. But they're not going to sell those cars. They're building massive factories. A friend of mine.
Well, let's now speak with Brian Klaas. He's Associate Professor in Global Politics at University College London. He's a real expert commentator on American politics, and he's the author of a brilliant new book called Fluke, Chance, Chaos, and Why Everything We Do Matters. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
And before we talk about your book, let's just pick up on that word that Donald Trump used at that rally. Now, he was talking about trade, but clearly that word bloodbath has really alerted people to, I suppose, the prospect of maybe another uprising if he doesn't win. What do you read into his words?
Well, I think there's debate about what his intended meaning was, but if you look at the broader context of that rally, the beginning of the rally involved Trump saluting while they played the national anthem sung by what he calls the January 6th hostages who are currently in prison for attacking police officers. And he called those people patriots and said that he would basically deal with them on day one of his presidency, hinting that he would pardon them. So, I mean, this is not something where you have to read between the lines. He's clearly suggesting that the January 6th insurrection was a good thing and that these people are to be applauded and should be released from prison. So, I think that the odds of a post-election or pre-election bout of political violence in the United States is very high. And I think that whether Trump wins or loses, I think there's a large number of people who have been primed to act by this violent rhetoric that he's been spewing for years. And I'm very worried about the election. I think the risks of violence are high.
Now, look, your book is all about fluke and chance and chaos. When you look at where American politics is right now, and you have Joe Biden going up against Donald Trump, two elderly candidates, a lot of people are kind of dissatisfied about the choice. Where do you think chance or a fluke got us where we are today?
Well, I think there's a few things that you can think about in that way. I mean, first off, there's one theory about Trump that he decided to run for president in 2011 when Barack Obama humiliated him with a excoriating joke at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. So that would certainly be a fluke where the one joke has gotten us to the situation. But I would say in a broader sense, I mean, when you look at the polls, you're looking at a snapshot in March of 2024. The election's in November. And, things happen all the time that upend races. At this point, 4 years ago, COVID lockdowns had just started to be discussed. And that defined much of the election. You'll recall that Trump famously talked about the possibility of injecting disinfectant to treat COVID during that campaign. And so, when we think about how the polls are looking right now, I have no idea who's going to win the election. But there's a lot of stuff that's going to change between now and November. This is going to be one of the most unusual elections in American history and in world history, I think, and one of the most consequential as well. So, I'm not going to prognosticate and say, oh, the polls clearly show us the answer. It's a snapshot, and it's many, many months to go in an extremely volatile political environment.
And look, your book talks a lot about fluke and chaos and chance. I mean, here in the UK, it feels like we've certainly been living under a lot of chaos. Is your argument that sort of political competency can trump chaos, or if there is just so much chaos, does that predetermine our political sort of outcomes?
Yeah, well, my argument is basically applying chaos theory to humans. And I think one of the things when you think about the 21st century is that we have been basically blindsided by a series of black swan events for the last 25 years. I mean, the history of the last 25 years is politicians trying to clean up stuff that is unexpected. You have 9/11, the war in Iraq that comes afterwards, the financial crisis, then the Arab Spring, which is sparked by a person lighting himself on fire in central Tunisia. And then you have the rise of Brexit, Trump, the pandemic with one person getting infected with a mutated virus, and now you have wars in Ukraine and Gaza. And I think the argument that I'm making is that, we're often told to ignore the noise, or that, oh, don't worry, our politicians will sort this out. I think the story of the last several decades is one that basically upends that idea and makes it clear that we are creating systems that are extremely fragile and are more and more prone to black swan events. And I think, when you look at British politics, nobody has that much faith in the system right now. And what's around the corner? Well, we're basically engineering systems that are extremely fragile, and we don't have the people in charge to deal with it. So I'm very worried about the fact that we've created global systems that are so interdependent that one little arbitrary event can really upend everything, and our politicians are certainly not up to the job.
And as you say, we don't have a lot of resilience in the system, and that was very much exposed in the pandemic, whether it was our sort of health, our social security, and indeed things like our supply chains, global supply chains, which we always thought were very, very robust, and they were put under stress. But I think what you've made is a really interesting point there, Brian, when you say that a lot of people feel that politicians and the political structures are not robust enough to cope with all of these, difficult things that come out of nowhere. Maybe that explains the attraction of the rise of the strongman, the President Xi's, the Erdogans, the Donald Trumps, if you like, the Viktor Orbans, or maybe that explains why populism works, in the sense that people do look at these men. They tend to be men. I mean, there's Giorgia Meloni in Italy, of course, who seem, they project this, an optic of strength. Maybe that's why people are sort of drawn to them, because they think that they will be strong enough to stop the chaos. It's like one of the lines that Trump supporters are saying, and he's saying it as well, saying, oh, President Putin didn't do this Ukraine stuff when Trump was there because he was a strong man and he wouldn't have done it. Do you think there's any truth in that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the paradox of populism, right? So, when you think about how quickly the world has changed, we literally live in a different world than we did even a generation ago. I grew up without the internet, and now I can't live without it, right? So, we're living in a moment of truly immense change for what it means to be a human in modern society. And that's extremely disorienting. So, when somebody comes along and says, don't worry, there's a simple answer to this, and I'll fix everything, it's seductive. And the problem, of course, is they can't fix everything. And I think, this is the real paradox, is that at the moment where we need people who are least hubristic, who are most aware of the limitations of our understanding of the world and most hesitant about certainty, that's when we're turning to the people who tell you, I know exactly what's happening. I know exactly what's going to fix it. Leave it to me, and I'll just do this one thing and everything will be fine. And that's where I think we're embedding and sort of worsening this situation of chaos in our system, in our social systems. So, it's seductive, but it's the worst possible answer to a moment of genuinely, I think, profound peril for the human race in terms of confronting problems of immense change at a faster pace than ever before in the history of our species. So it's the worst possible time for populism to rise, and yet, it's a very seductive message.
And look, just going back, just picking up on something you said earlier, do you think that there will be some sort of more political violence in America, another attempt at an insurrection? Do you honestly think that's possible?
I think that something worse is possible. I mean, I think that it's a weird way to look at January 6th, but January 6th, I think the US lucked out in some ways that it wasn't worse. I mean, there were people with zip ties who got into the Capitol hoping to kidnap politicians. There were fake nooses outside of the Capitol. There was a pipe bomb that was placed that didn't explode. So, I mean, I think that January 6th could have been much worse.